Welcome back to the Impact Storytelling Podcast. I'm your host Sabine Probst, and today I'm joined by underwater visual storyteller, marine scientist, science communicator, and the founder of Light Palace Productions, Dr. Shireen Rahimi. Shireen is an Iranian-American scientist, National Geographic Explorer, and filmmaker dedicated to understanding the most effective media techniques for driving actions on environmental issues. Based in Florida, she's focusing on using storytelling to highlight the human connections to rapidly changing oceans and inspire conservation efforts. Since becoming a National Geographic Young Explorer in 2017, Shireen has been featured on National Geographic's channels Sharkfest and NatGeo Wild, showcasing her work on shark-human interactions in the Bahamas and in Florida. Through her photography and films, Shireen captures the complex relationship between people and oceans, documenting regions such as the South Pacific, the Coral Triangle, and the Caribbean. Her work spotlights tropical coral reefs, one of the earliest and most significant ecological casualties of climate change. By focusing on emotional, character-driven narratives, Shireen aims to amplify the marginalized voices of marine ecosystems and inspire action to address the ongoing ecological crisis. Welcome. I'm excited to be talking with you today. I have heard that your journey with the ocean and photography started as a kid. What were your most memorable moments of that time?
Thanks for having me, Sabine. I always had a camera in my hand. I would just steal my parents' camera or my grandpa's camera. I obviously started on land because that's where you are usually when you're a kid. And I think I can't even remember what that was like, but I think I was always kind of drawn to it. And then as I got older, my grandpa bought me a film camera, an analog film camera, when I was maybe 13. And yeah, I was obsessed with it. And as I got older, my parents are both immigrants from Iran. I grew up in California. And so I kind of grew up with this idea that if, you wanted to be successful, you'd have to be an engineer or a doctor. And so I was like, and so I grew up with that, but I also grew up with the idea, my grandpa was an explorer of sorts. He mountain climbed throughout Iran. My uncle on my father's side was a big explorer. He would do these long cross country treks in Iran. And so I had these two sides of my kind of generational background, and I guess I ended up combining them in a way that felt true to me by becoming a scientist and getting a PhD. So I was finally a doctor. So I found a loophole to the doctor thing. Got a PhD in marine science, the lowest paying doctorate you could possibly get. And then, throughout my process, I realized I really loved photography, and I kind of realized that there was this way to combine the two. And so once I figured out how to do that, the rest was history.
Do you still shoot a lot on film, or are you mostly digital now?
I shoot on film when I'm on vacation and shooting for fun. But it's hard to shoot film underwater for so many reasons. So I don't shoot film underwater. But maybe one day when I retire, I'll start shooting film underwater.
And you just told us why you started your journey into science. But what made you decide your research focus?
When I was 13, I went on a trip with my family. I grew up like middle to upper middle class in California. And my family really prioritized travel as the thing that we spent our money on. And so we went to the islands of St. Thomas, I remember, and we went on one of those snorkel boats where they take a bunch of people out and you go out and snorkel. And I saw a healthy coral reef for the first time, and something clicked in me. I was like, this is the most incredibly beautiful thing I've ever laid eyes on. You know, the sun was dappling through the water and casting rainbows on the bottom, and the colors of the corals, there were pinks and purples, and the water was so clear and crystal blue. And there was a school of squid swimming by, you know, like changing colors. And I was just mesmerized. And I don't think I thought about it much after that. But once I graduated from college and I was trying to decide, you know, what I wanted to continue my studies in, I was very drawn to coral reefs. And when I decided to do my PhD, I really wanted to study coral reefs in Cuba because I thought that was such a fascinating intersection between marine ecosystems, so coral reef ecosystems that support people's livelihoods, and then also the socio-political side of Cuba being so unique and such a different case to how we function in the US. It was kind of like we got to a choose your own adventure, and the US took one route and Cuba took a completely different route in terms of how to structure economies and society. And that had really different impacts on the reefs. And so the first project that I did for storytelling was a project comparing coral reefs in Cuba and those in Florida, and looking at how the different socio-political contexts within those two different places led to very different like health states in the reefs.
That sounds really interesting. And what were your findings?
So I found that coral reefs in Cuba benefited. Coral reefs in Cuba that were far from dense urban centers benefited from a lack of point sources of pollution. And so the water quality was near perfect. And this really benefited the corals. However, Cuba has other issues, right? The way that, the lack of resources in Cuba because of the way the country is run, because of the blockade with the United States. There's severe food shortages. And so people were supplementing their protein with what they could get from the land and the sea, and that included fish. And so severely overfished in the places that I was working. They were, national parks that were supposedly supposed to be protected, but severely overfished. You couldn't find anything. I wasn't in the very protected parts. There's a place called Gardens of the Queen that's highly protected and has very high fish and biomass densities. But really what I found was that in both Cuba and Florida, there were differences, but really to the biggest predictors of reef health were how far they were from industry and from tourism pressure. So I went to 2 sites in both places. In Cuba, I was in a very remote site called Cocodrilo, which is on the Isle of Youth, and then a site closer to urban centers called Varadero. And like the difference was very stark. Varadero was very degraded. I saw almost no living coral cover on some of the reefs. And then in Cocodrilo, the coral was remarkably healthy, just lacked fish. And then in Florida, it was the same, between the dry tortugas, which was my more remote site, the corals were incredibly healthy. This was before disease had hit, the white band disease had hit. And then in the Keys, they were incredibly degraded. So it was kind of more of the findings were more that wherever you can find humans, the corals probably aren't going to be doing so great. And that, we need to work on various conservation measures as well as figuring out climate change.
Do you think that the countries have to do something, and also that as when we go somewhere as tourists or live somewhere with the reefs, that there should be more education about how to be there as a tourist, but also, of course, I think like pollution is a big factor, right? If like the companies or the cities are putting pollution in. What do you think could be the solutions?
Of course, we need conservation measures to give reefs the best chance of surviving, especially on a warming planet. And what that looks like is wastewater management in order to make sure that pollution isn't seeping out into the water. That's a huge issue here in Florida, especially in Miami our wastewater management is like there's a lot of leakage, and that leads to a lot of pollution in our bay, which has led to massive seagrass die-offs and fish kills. So that's a big thing. And then we also need to make sure that our fisheries are properly regulated. And, our fisheries here in Florida are also overfished, and we need more regulation around that. In Cuba, it's like, what are you going to tell people? Like, don't eat, it's hard to say that, but that needs to be figured out, because those reefs are silent. And then obviously climate change. We need to get climate change under control, because we could do everything else right, but if the water continues to get to boiling temperatures, then there's going to be there's no way for the corals to survive.
Let's go a bit back again. What inspired you to combine photography and science, or film and science? And how did this shift shape your career?
I think I wanted to combine photography with science because I just really love photography, but I also wasn't sure if I wanted to become a photographer, because I knew that meant realistically doing a lot of commercial work, and I didn't want to shoot weddings, like that wasn't something I was interested in. And so I was like, okay, I need to figure out how to make money, like how to support my life, and then do photography on the side maybe. But then while I was doing the photography during my time in the field in Cuba, the Bahamas, and Chile is where I was doing most of my field work during my PhD, I realized that people were so much more engaged with the images that I was creating, the films and the photos that I was creating, than they were with the science that I was doing. And so I became very convinced of the power of media in shifting perspectives and driving impact around ocean conservation. And that's why I applied for a grant from National Geographic to get a housing for my camera so I could take it underwater. And once I started doing that work, the response was really clear. It was that, like, there's a lot of people doing really incredible science, but there aren't as many people telling the stories of that science. And those stories need to be told if we want to see change.
And with your work, you are looking at the most effective media techniques for driving action on environmental issues. What have you found to work best so far? And do you have any example of your work that was especially impactful?
Yeah, it's a very environmental media, the study of, what works in driving, social change with media around conservation and the environment. It's a new field. There isn't a lot of work around it yet, but I think it's definitely growing, and we're continuing to get more insight into what gets people to care and to act. From what I understand, from what I kind of drew from my studies during my PhD while I was studying this was, there is like a fine balance to strike between doom and gloom and hope. And because some people are motivated by doom and gloom, and some people are motivated by hope. And in the end, it's like, you really just want to tell the truth. And the truth is that there's a lot of both. And so what I'm focused on with my storytelling is not just telling hopeful stories or just telling doom and gloom stories, but being honest about what's wrong with our planet and what's wrong with the way that we're living on this earth, but also being very intentional about focusing on solutions, because when we focus on solutions, we get more done and we make more progress, and being hopeful, but not in a way that's inauthentic, like I want to be authentically hopeful. And I think that's something that's really, really resonates with audiences these days, is authenticity. Especially young people, they can sniff out inauthentic narratives within a fraction of a second. Like, they are so media literate. They understand like how to use phones, and they understand media and even like the tone of your voice. So that is something that I think is a strength of my work, is that I I'm not just like peddling hope, false hope. It's like it's hope grounded in realism, and a realistic take on like what's wrong and what we need to do to fix it.
And as we just touched on, your scientific work often involves corals. Could you elaborate on why coral reefs are so vital, both ecologically and economically?
Yeah, coral reefs support our lives in so many ways. They protect our coastlines. They are literally living seawalls that protect our coastlines from storms and natural disasters. They provide us with food. Despite covering just less than 1% of the ocean floor, they harbor 25% of marine biodiversity, which means that so many of the fish that we eat start their lives or live their lives on coral reefs. And the ocean, if managed properly, could feed 1 billion people. And so it's very important that we keep them alive. They also contain chemicals that can be found in, compounds that can be found in, that have been found in animals like sea snails and other invertebrates that live on the reef that have given us really important medicines, medicines for treating cancer and blood pressure. And, how many medicines are there on the reef that we haven't even discovered yet? And if we that's a really important part of why we need to conserve these reefs, because they could be a treasure trove of life-saving compounds. And they make so much money. The tourism industry around coral reefs around the world is like in the billions. So, and even here in Florida, it's such a big part of our economy. So, yeah, it's not just pretty things to look at or something to do because we want to feel good about ourselves. They are the rainforests of the sea. And if we lose them, then we lose a huge part of our oceans, and we depend on the oceans for our lives. So no oceans, no us.
What do you think about tourism on coral reefs? Do you think there are negative effects? And if so, is it better that the communities have the money from tourism because they need it? Or would it be better if there would be less tourism, or at least better educated tourism and better regulated? Because I feel like often people don't know how to really behave underwater, and then they knock something over or touch everything, and that isn't so good.
Yeah, I agree. But I think tourism is such a critical part of how we're going to make sure that these places stay conserved, because if you have a community that needs to make a living off of their natural resources and you don't want them to fish as much, then how are you going to give them a living? Tourism is one of the only options. And so in many places. And so if it's between tourists visiting a place and fishing out the whole place, and I would definitely choose tourism. And like you said, it just needs to be educated. They need to have systems in place to educate people as to how to act in the water, making sure that there are regulations to make sure that people aren't maybe snorkeling in very shallow areas so that they're kicking coral and stuff like that. Making sure that dive operators really understand what they're doing. And so, yeah, I think well-educated tourism experiences are one of the best ways that we have found to, make sure that places stay healthy and continue to sustainably give communities income.
At Wildscreen, you pitched your newest project, and you mentioned that corals in Florida are functionally collapsed, affecting marine ecosystems and the communities that rely on them. For the people who don't know what functional coral reefs look like, can you please explain, as well as what happens if they don't function right anymore?
Right. So corals are sessile animals. They are attached to the bottom and they don't move, which is why many people think they're plants, but they're not. They're actually animals. When that is how you live your life as a coral, that means that in order to reproduce, you need to be kind of close together, right? There needs to be enough coral in an area so that when one coral releases sperms and eggs in a spawning event, there needs to be other coral close by that it can fertilize with, create coral babies, and then settle on the bottom and grow into a new coral. So that when spawning events happen, like new coral is being created to restore the coral that are dying due to whatever the impacts may be, pollution, climate change, and bleaching, or so on and so forth. In Florida, we've lost so much coral in many of the sites that one of my nonprofit partners that I work with, Coral Restoration Foundation, many of the sites that they work on in the Florida Keys have as low as 2% coral coverage. And so that's very small. That's like pretty much as it's close to as bad as it can get. 100% coral coverage is like fully healthy. So if you think about 2%, and they are working to restore these areas so that there's more coral on the reef, so that when they do reproduce, that they can create new coral. But because those numbers are so small, that's why scientists say that these reefs have gone functionally extinct, because in order to reproduce, these scientists need to wait for the spawning to happen with the few colonies that are there and the few colonies that they have in restoration or in nurseries, gather that spawn, kind of assist its reproduction, grow them into little coral babies that they then outplant on the reef. So it's kind of like IVF for coral, or like assisted fertilization. And so that's what I mean when I say that the coral reefs have gone functionally extinct. And that doesn't mean that they are gone forever. They can be restored, but we need to reduce the stressors on these reefs, including climate change, increasing water temperatures, overfishing, and pollution.
And in the same talk, you talked about supercorals. What are they, and what makes the corals in the northern Red Sea particularly resilient to climate change?
Yeah, I love this story. I think supercorals are so cool. So in the northern Red Sea, there's this remarkably resilient type of coral that scientists are now calling supercorals. And they exist there because of the unique way that corals evolved to occupy the Red Sea. And so basically after the last ice age about 10,000 years ago, the water levels were much lower, right? Because a lot of the water was locked in ice. Once that ice age started to end and the ice started to melt, sea levels started to rise, much like they are today because of global warming. And as that water rose, it went into the Red Sea, which is basically this long north to south little stretch of ocean, not little, but big. And then at the very bottom, there's this opening. It's called the Strait of It's the strait between Djibouti and Yemen, or some. I might have that wrong, but it's a strait and it's a very small opening. And so when that water comes in, any of the animals or corals that were going to expand into that new range had to expand through a bottleneck of very shallow, very hot, very high sunlight conditions. And so it was basically an evolutionary bottleneck. And so all of the corals that went into that space had to be pretty heat resistant. Once they entered the space, they then had access to this vast ecological niche that crossed north to south, which meaning that as they spread further north, they came across lower and lower temperatures. And so here are these corals that basically have won the evolutionary lottery because they have heat resistant genetics and they've now spread into lower temperature ranges. And so these corals, I think up until recently, had never bleached because they had such high heat tolerance and such low temperatures. I think the most northernmost coral reefs in the world, tropical coral reefs in the world. And so that's why these corals are so resilient. And scientists are trying to figure out, why did these corals retain their resilience despite thousands of years of not needing it anymore? What is it about their genetics that makes them, that confers this resilience? Could we use techniques to confer that resilience to corals in other places that need it more? Basically, I'm working with a scientist there named Dr. Islam Osman. He's also a NatGeo explorer, because he's doing this work to understand what makes these supercorals so resilient. And it's really incredible because these corals are projected to be some of the last living coral reefs on our planet by the end of the century, persisting past even 3 degrees Celsius rise, when 90% of corals are expected to have collapsed. So theoretically, they could be the corals of the future that allow us to that stay alive long enough to allow us to restore reefs once we get climate change under control.
And with the potential of bioengineering corals for resilience, what are the ethical and practical considerations of using genetic technology to restore coral reefs globally? And is there also a way maybe for other corals to just adapt to the warming temperatures without bioengineering anything?
I think that there are examples of corals adapting. Which I wouldn't say it's widespread. I think mostly coral reefs are just seeing mass mortality events because they cannot keep up with the rate of warming. Evolution isn't fast enough to deal with the rate that our world is warming at. There is a coral that I've heard about, a blue coral in Australia, that has actually started to thrive because of climate change. It thrives in warmer waters. So that's like an interesting example of how, it's not all doom and gloom for every coral species. As far as ethical considerations, yes, there are a lot of ethical concerns. There are scientists that are doing something called assisted migration, where you move corals from more heat resilient corals from other places into places that need more coral and need more heat resilient coral. There's ethical considerations with that because corals are not just one animal. They're a complex of animals. The coral itself is an animal, and it also lives symbiotically with an algae, a symbiotic algae that lives in its tissues basically, and uses photosynthesis to give it the bulk of its food. And also, obviously, the microbes that live with these corals. There's like a whole assemblage of microbiomes in corals, just like there is in our stomachs. And so when you move corals from, for example, there's a scientist at UM doing this, moving corals from Central America to Florida. When you do this, you introduce the potential for spreading disease, for spreading, invasive species or whatever it might be. We've seen what happens when you move animals from different places to places where they don't belong. Sometimes it can have negative consequences. But also, I think scientists are keeping all of these things into consideration and doing a lot of like the risk management that is necessary to make sure that whatever they're doing is has the lowest amount of risks in terms of having adverse effects on the reefs. But yeah, there's a lot of concern, but I think that this field has really shifted from a few years ago until now, where at one point there were a lot of scientists that were against coral restoration. Even in 2015, 2016, there were still a lot of scientists that thought that restoration was a terrible idea because coral reefs shouldn't be restored. They have to grow naturally. And, but now look at the field of coral restoration. It's everywhere. And we're starting to just really realize that we don't really have a choice at this point. We have to try everything we can to buy time really, until we can figure out how to get the oceans to a point where they're once again hospitable to coral reefs.
And does the coral restoration just work with hard corals, or has it ever been done with soft corals as well?
You know, that's a good question. I've never heard of coral restoration on soft corals. Only hard corals. And I think the reason for that is that when you restore hard corals, you are restoring the substrate that soft corals can grow on. And so those are the really important corals to restore, because when you restore hard corals, you're basically restoring the keystone species that creates the habitat for everything else on the reef. Yeah, so it's kind of like building the house so that the people can come live in it.
That's very well explained. And how was it for you to see the healthy corals in the Red Sea compared to the degraded reefs in Florida? How did this contrast impact your perspective on conservation?
I mean, I live and work in Florida, but a lot of my work is international. So I've seen incredible coral reefs all over the world. And I like to tell people that because I think a lot of people have this impression that all the reefs everywhere are dead. They are not. There are reefs around the world that look very much like they did, you know, decades ago, because they happen to be in, you know, good conditions where there are lots of current and the water doesn't get too hot and there's not a lot of people around and not a lot of industry. So I've been lucky enough to see some of the most incredible coral reefs in the world, but it was still so incredible to see the Red Sea because it's always just such a joy when you see a reef that's healthy and functioning, because it's just such a constant stream of bad news in Florida. And also when you're a scientist and especially when you work on climate as well, like it's very sad all the time, like all the news you're reading. And so anytime I see a healthy reef, it's like, it's very special and it's very impactful, especially the Red Sea, because it's a place that I have ties to as a Middle Eastern woman. It was very, very cool to get on location and see people that look like me, have people like understand how to say my name, you know, and, you know, see writing that looks like mine. So that was really special to have like a cultural connection with these coral reefs, that I normally just feel like a visitor to.
As a visual storyteller, how do you approach documenting these sick reefs in Florida and the scientists working to preserve them?
Yeah, again, I try to focus on the solutions because there are a lot of them. And I think that when we focus on the solutions, we not just feel better. It's not about like feeling better. It's good that we feel better, but we feel motivated and we feel like there's something that we can do about it. And I think a lot of people, me included, might, like at one point I was kind of in this place where I was like, why are we restoring coral if they're just going to die like next year, you know? But I was talking to someone that I really look up to at Coral Restoration Foundation, a scientist, and she was like, even if it's just on the reef for 2 years, that coral provided an ecosystem function for 2 years. So I think that my perspective on the state of coral reefs and climate has really changed in the last couple of years, in that I've realized that this isn't a dichotomy. It's not either we figure it out or we all die, you know, like either climate change doesn't happen or it does. That's not really what we're dealing with anymore. It's more of, there is a spectrum of possibilities before us, and we have to choose how bad it's going to get and how much suffering we're going to avoid by every action that we do. And every little bit counts. Every 10th of a degree of warming means, certain, like a certain amount of lives saved. And so it's, I think that's how I approach it now, is that I do not approach it in absolutes anymore. I approach it as like, there is a spectrum of possibilities and we're fighting for the best possible outcome.
And for people that are going diving or snorkeling and they don't know what a sick coral or dead coral looks like versus a healthy coral, can you explain the difference in the way they look?
Yeah. So when a coral is living, it has a color. It could look dark orange. It could look pink. It could look purple, blue. Blue is my favorite coral. It could be, pale color. It could be beige. And then when a coral is bleached, that's basically a stress response in the coral where it feels really stressed out because of warm water or something else, and it expels its algae. It's kind of like when we get pale after we see something scary. And that bleaching response, when that coral gets bleached, it looks stark white. So really, really white. Maybe a tiny bit off white, but pretty white. It's kind of unmistakable underwater because it's something that you don't normally see. And then when a coral is dead, so if it bleaches and then it doesn't recover, it dies, then algae starts to grow over the coral. And when algae grows over the coral, it turns like a grayish, brownish, yellowish, some kind of combination of those things. The kind of like small microalgae that kind of grows in a mat over the coral, and that is when the coral is officially dead. And then after that, macroalgae can grow on it. So these bigger species of algae can grow on the coral. So if you see something that looks like plants growing on coral, or like a fuzzy, if you can't see the little holes, if it's like a fuzzy kind of like mat over the coral and it's kind of grayish brown, then that coral is dead. And eventually that algae, because the coral isn't alive anymore, it's not building a skeleton, the algae will eventually break down that skeleton. The coral reef will become flatter and more like polished, and it'll kind of start to look like rocks.
How do you hope that your films and photographs influence people's understanding of coral reefs and inspire action for their preservation?
I'm hoping that my work can spotlight examples of when people and corporations and governments and communities have decided to invest in and protect coral reefs and our oceans in order to convince others of the importance of doing the same, because there are so many benefits, but sometimes it's not very clear what those benefits are because they can take a bit longer to come about, or they can be a little bit indirect, So like if a corporation is funding a coral restoration project, that restoration project might take, 4 or 5 years in order to show results. It might take the community a few years before they start seeing fish stocks rebound. So I think my job is to tell stories of when investment in our oceans, investment in the blue economy, investment in community-led initiatives around coral reefs and also just our oceans in general, when those things work, to show that it's a model worth pursuing within the current systems that we have, but also as a way of re-envisioning the way that we set up our economic systems to value life as opposed to profits.
And you also have expertise in blue carbon ecosystems. What are these ecosystems and why are these ecosystems significant, and what are the common misconceptions about them?
Blue carbon is the concept of how ecosystems related to the ocean have these remarkable abilities to sequester carbon. So to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and put it into the ground or into living matter. Examples are mangroves, seagrasses, peat marsh, and other ecosystems that basically take carbon dioxide out of the air and the water. And they're important because they have become a big part of they have a tie to the financial sector, because if you are restoring these ecosystems, you can sell that as carbon credits. So through the carbon credit structure, you can get paid for restoring these ecosystems. These ecosystems are important to restore because they are basically a big part of how we are going to reach a place where, we are putting enough emissions in the ground, or, recapturing enough emissions, and in order to address climate change and get climate change under control. I would say a big misconception around blue carbon is that I think that a lot of companies think that they can just emit and do business as usual and then just buy carbon credits to call it a day. But a lot of these carbon credits are tied to, restoration projects that might not be as legitimate as they seem, or, there's a lot of issues around like monitoring and measuring the impact of different restoration projects. And then even if they are legitimate and they are putting a lot of carbon in the ground, there is such a difference. Like there is nothing more effective for reducing emissions than keeping fossil fuels in the ground, because fossil fuels have been sequestered in our earth for millions of years. Whereas, a mangrove ecosystem, like if a storm comes through and rips up a mangrove forest and tears up all the substrate in a mangrove forest, all the carbon that was being sequestered by that system is now being released back into the air. So it's kind of like you can't just keep burning like the highest potency, fossil fuel emissions and then putting it away in these like more temporary, like short-term stocks of carbon, because those two things aren't equivalent. So I think there's a misconception around blue carbon as like this is going to save us. It's not. It's good to do, and it's buying us time, and it's helping support communities, and it's helping re-envision how we want to structure our communities, our societies, our economies. But the most important thing is that we stop emitting carbon emissions. And that's, it's tough because it's a multi-trillion dollar industry, the fossil fuel industry. And they have a lot of powerful people that want to keep that industry not just around still, but growing. They've had record profits in recent years, and we've had the highest, the warmest, some of the warmest record days in recent, these things are coinciding. So obviously they're connected, and we need to tackle the fossil fuel industry. I think that's a big priority.
And what do you think individuals could do to help that matter?
Individuals, we can vote for politicians that prioritize climate. But I think another thing that a lot of people don't know is that in the early 2000s, British Petroleum, one of the biggest fossil fuel industries in the world, put forth this massive marketing campaign around the concept of the carbon footprint. And they put out a calculator, and they wanted people to calculate their carbon footprint. And this was all a big marketing ploy to get people to basically deflect blame for the climate crisis onto individuals, and to get consumers to feel like, oh, I need to do something to address my climate footprint. And to kind of deflect blame away from the fossil fuel companies that are really driving, like, whatever one individual is emitting is infinitesimal compared to what a fossil fuel company is emitting. And so it was a misinformation, like a very manipulative campaign, and it convinced a lot of people that it's their responsibility to get this in order. That's not true. It's the responsibility of politicians and the fossil fuel industry. But also, I think it's also very important for us to live lives that are in line with our values, because that's how we build integrity as people, and that's how we live lives that feel good to us, but also are of service to the world, which I think is the only way to live. And so, no, it's not it's not just on us to figure out the climate crisis, but it is important that we do what we can to minimize how much carbon we're emitting. You can drive, get a bike, get an electric car, have one less child than you want. Children are very carbon intensive. Fly less if you can afford it. My carbon footprint is really bad. I fly a lot for work. And so the way that I justify that is that I buy carbon credits to offset that. Also, eating less meat. Livestock is a big contributor to carbon emissions. So there's a lot of things we can do, but we also need to not lose sight of who's really responsible.
Yeah. I remember that campaign from the early 2000s you mentioned. We had to calculate our own footprint in school that was a part of our classes back then. So I still remember that.
It was a very successful campaign.
Yeah. And I think there are also way more products that have oil in it that most people realize. So I think even just from a health standpoint, we should look more into what we consume and what we do. Just a pointer on that.
Yeah, and the clothes we wear.
Yeah.
I mean, any polyester, synthetic materials, that's all oil.
Or makeup sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
And how can we use ocean solutions to mitigate climate change effectively?
So this is a question this is the question that my work is kind of centered around at the moment. The ocean, centering the ocean as our greatest ally in the fight against climate change. And the reason why it's our greatest ally is because, well, number one, the blue carbon that I talked about earlier. The ocean is incredibly resilient, and there are so many ways that it can help us sequester carbon. And then the ocean is a huge source of food for us, and so there are ways that we can use it that are very different than the ways we're using it right now, in terms of pillaging the oceans, emptying them of all life in order to make as much profit as possible. This is not a sustainable way to interact with the ocean. If we sustainably managed and sustainably harvested fish from the ocean, it would give us 6 times the amount of food that it is currently giving us, which is, it's insane to think about that. People say people overfish because they're hungry. It's yes, that's true. But if we had if we were able to look at these things with some level of long-term thinking and insight, we would get 6 times the amount of food and profit and all these things. So there are different ways we need to be thinking about these. We need to be thinking about the ocean as our friend, and the way that we can have it sustainably support our livelihoods is through blue carbon, through regenerative ocean farming, which involves the cultivation and harvesting of seaweed, shellfish, these species that are high in protein, are carbon negative, and that support the livelihoods of communities, and are honestly easier to figure out than fishing, because fishing has gotten really hard with stocks dwindling. And then, the ocean, it's our greatest friend also because it absorbs 90% of the excess heat in our atmosphere, and 25% of emissions, I think, is absorbed by our ocean. So it's literally our buffer from complete annihilation on our planet, and we need to give back to it and treat it with the respect it deserves, and it will provide for us immensely.
Your work often involves confronting the dark truths about climate change. How do you balance this with maintaining hope and inspiring others?
I think this goes back to what we were talking about earlier about how I'm approaching this with a different perspective, that it's not a binary. It's not, either we'll live or we'll survive. It's like we need to fight for the best possible outcome. And that's what gives me hope. That's what makes me motivated to go out and just still work as hard as I can to make whatever small contribution I can to this. Because I want to be in the future remembered as like one of a big group of very passionate people who did everything they could to avert humanity from disaster.
What's the one message you want listeners to take away about our relationship with the ocean and its role in combating climate crisis?
I guess my one message would be that if we don't figure out, without the ocean, we have nothing. Our lives we cannot live without our ocean. And if we let it get to a point where it's no longer functional, our lives will change dramatically. And it's hard to predict what that will feel like right now, because we've always had it and we've taken it for granted. But no ocean, no life. And so I think the one message I would say is that anything that you do to help the ocean will help you and your descendants. And so it's in all of our best interest.
We're already at the last question. For young people or aspiring scientists and storytellers, what advice would you give about making an impact in environmental conservation?
I would say, if you want to make an impact as a conservationist, look around you wherever you are, and try to find something that needs to be done. Try to find what's needed and do that work. Not the work that's the coolest, not the work that you see on Instagram, not the work that is like, the most dreamy, but do the work that needs to be done, and it will lead you to the work of your dreams, because we are all here to live lives of service. I truly believe that. And when we do live lives of service in line with what we care about and what makes us happy, then the return is just like beyond what you could imagine.
Thank you so much. That's great advice. Thank you for having been on the podcast. It was great talking with you. I hope to talk with you soon again about your new projects.
Thank you, Sabine. It's so nice to be here. Thanks for having me.